Coming up, we've got a special double episode with Professor Mayank Varia from Boston University. We're going to talk about the debate around encryption. And actually what we're going to try to do is inform both the technology and policy sides so that we can do better at our business as well as by society. And it all starts with the answer, or at least the search for an answer, to a simple question. Business Security Weekly starts now.
This is Security Weekly, for security professionals, by security professionals. Broadcasting live from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, it's the show where we explore the business of security to improve the security of business. Your trusted source for actionable insights on leadership, communication, and innovation. Get ready for Business Security Weekly. Brought to you by, do you have a website, an external presence, employees, an office? Any of these things can be compromised and attacked. How are you defending your assets? Have you penetration tested your public assets? Start 2018 by taking a proactive approach to securing your vulnerable areas. Black Hills Information Security has been helping companies find their weaknesses since 2008. Email consulting at blackhillsinfosec.com and see how they can help you sleep better at night. Are you getting pressure to improve your data security? Would you like a faster, easier, better way to patch? Then you need to check out Automox. Automox is a cloud-native platform that patches and manages every endpoint, even remote servers and devices, including Windows, Mac, Linux, and third-party software from a single dashboard. Improve your cyber hygiene, reduce your attack surface, and save 90% of the effort you spend patching. Automox, your patching system of record. Today's determined attackers easily bypass even the most advanced network defenses. Trying to ramp up staff to detect their backdoors can cost thousands of dollars and take months, even years. With Active Countermeasures AI Hunter, we enable junior analysts to detect even the most advanced backdoors in a matter of hours. Sign up for a demo and purchase our product today by visiting activecountermeasures.com/BSW. Active Countermeasures. Make every analyst a hunter.
Hello and welcome. It's Business Security Weekly, episode number 92, recorded live Monday, July 16th, 2018. This is the show where the business of security and is. Our goal is to be your trusted source for actionable insights, leadership, communication, and innovation. I'm still Michael Santarcangelo, hasn't changed yet, and I get the pleasure of working both with enterprise security teams and vendors, looking at how we translate value and get better results faster. And it's my privilege to be able to share those things that I learned with you today as part of our discussions. And speaking of conversations and great discussions, joining me from G-Unit Studios in Rhode Island, your friend, my friend, everybody's friend, the cowbell of the network, Paul S.
Maybe not everyone, but I'm friendly, I guess you could say. You are too, Michael. It's good to be here. It's good to be here sharing.
It's nice to see you again.
Yeah, it's good to see you as well. I know summertime's tough with vacations and people get busy with work. It's all good.
Yeah, Sam mentioned that word. I've never heard that word before.
Right?
I was like, fascinating. Well, that's great.
I've got contractors replacing my entire HVAC system and water heater today, so I'm not going on any vacations anytime soon. I'm going to enjoy the hot water in the shower and the nice air conditioning in my house for a while.
So you'll be clean and comfortable.
That's right.
Both.
That's right.
Fantastic. Yeah. All right. Well, so I want to get into this discussion, but quick first announcement, because we've worked hard on this for a while. We've got our survey going, our listener survey. The easiest way to get to this, just go to securityweekly.com. You're going to see upper right-hand side says 2018 survey. It's pretty easy. It's right there, nice white letters. You can grab it. I'm watching this. It's taking the average person about 5 minutes to fill this out. It's a couple multiple choice questions and a couple open-ended things where you can tell us the things that you like, the problems that you're trying to solve, what we can do better, what you want to see more of, right? More cowbell, more Paul, of course, is an option. But we're really looking at this pretty seriously, and we're looking at the results of it, and this is helping us show by show and network-wide and everything else. And this is going to help us immeasurably help you over the course of the coming year. If you could take 5 minutes and give us a shot, that'd be absolutely fantastic. All right, so we kind of set this up. And Professor Varia, I've had a chance now to talk to him a couple times to really look at this. And that's why we did a double segment on this. So let me just quickly introduce why I'm excited about this and a little bit about what this means. we've invited Professor Varia to share with us some of the core ideas of his paper, both on a technical and on the policy side. And one of the things he asked quickly was, well, how does this work for the audience? Here's how I see it. First of all, we need to inform that dialogue. More and more, especially the CISOs that I've been working with, they're being called on by the executive suite and the board to teach them about some of the stuff that's happening out there, not just in the trenches, but some of the stuff, broader implications that we need to know about. And then it gives us another opportunity to explore our ethics and what matters to us societally, what matters to us individually. I think in our security community, the heightened awareness, the heightened interest in security, the headlines every day now are talking about cyber something. It gives us a lot of opportunities to really think about how to frame these discussions. And so then the business side of this is not so much about deploying it, but as we go through this and talk about it, what are the decisions that might be relevant in your business? At what point might your business get involved or not involved? So there's a lot of different dimensions to this. And what we're really looking at here is not some fancy new way to roll out encryption in your organization. It's much more about what's possible, what's technically feasible to us today, and how does that change some of the debates that we're having. And everybody knows I'm a huge fan of informing debate and discussion as opposed to just knocking stuff out. So with that said, let me introduce Professor Varia to us. And Professor, I didn't do like a lot of background. Is there something that you want to share with people about your time at BU and maybe some of your background that got you to where you are today? And then we can jump into it.
Sure. So I'm a research associate professor here at Boston University. You can see from the fancy logos in the back. And I've been here at BU for about 3+ years now. And my background and specialty is in cryptography. I did my PhD at MIT a while back now.
What got you excited? I'm just quick as we get into this. What got you excited about crypto in the first place? What drew you to it?
Yeah, so my background actually, I started when I started graduate school, I actually had no plans to do cryptography. I was actually I started as a pure math person and quickly realized that while pure math is sort of fun, it's the work that you do, by the time you figure out if anybody in society really cares, more often than not, you're dead. The lead time on math transitioning into practice is pretty large. And what appealed to me about cryptography is it's basically the intersection of math and social sciences. It's the application of math to problems of actual social value today, and sort of being able to use the skills that I have from math, but to have more impact and to really think more clearly and more directly about questions that pertain to society, including what we're going to discuss today.
That's awesome. That is probably the best answer I've ever heard. I'm like, you kind of have me excited about it again. And I shared with you, I have some experience with crypto dating back over the last 20 years. Certainly you've forgotten more than I've ever known, but it's certainly an area that I get excited about. And what I love about this then is like when I asked you, okay, how did you get started on this? You said something along the lines of, you were positing the question, is it possible to build a system and give access to some without giving access to all? So what's where did that come from? Did that bubble up somewhere in your research, or you mentioned you had a friend that you were talking with about it? So how did this bubble up and how did you get started down this path?
That's right. Yeah. So the entire project that we're going to talk about today is all joint work with a friend of mine, Charles Wright, who's an assistant professor at Portland State University. And we both sort of separately had been thinking about this. It really didn't have anything to do with any prior research either of us had done, but had been like sort of bubbling in our heads in the over the past, half decade or so, with all of the resurgence in the quote unquote crypto wars, these debates that seem to flare up every decade or two about the role of encryption in society, and specifically the role of encryption in the context of law enforcement. And the debates that have been had on this topic going back almost 40 years now have sort of, at least as played out in the public space, have tended to be very absolutist positions on one side or another. Either that we build encryption that is so strong that it is technologically impossible for law enforcement to have access to any information that is encrypted whatsoever, or we build encryption schemes that are effectively weak enough that there is no technological technological limit. Maybe there's legal limits or other limits, but there's no technological barrier to entry to all information. So it's sort of this all or none bifurcation. And I posit that basically nobody in the world is actually interested in either of these absolutes. Even people at, say, the FBI on the one side, or say, to use a U.S. focus, or people at, say, the Electronic Frontier Foundation or the ACLU, they probably have pretty different views from one another, but neither of them probably have such extreme views that they actually match what has been discussed in the public space about this sort of discussion about the role of encryption in society. So really, what started us on this is sort of thinking that, like, if the discussion, even after n decades where n is large, is so stilted, then really the issue at play here is fundamentally about the technology. That it's a limitation of the technology that it forces society into a debate where neither of the options really look that appealing. So that was really what got us started on this question.
Okay, so then how do you then transition that back? Because what I kind of got the sense is you looked at this and said, wait, hold on. Are we even talking about the technical side of this accurately or not? Right? Because I like the fact that you talked about it's that intersection of the math with the social sciences to it. So did you come at it initially to say, hold on, I can do some of that with crypto? Or are they even like, what kind of prompted that base level question and that you and your colleagues started kicking around?
So I think one thing that prompted our question is sort of thinking through the fact that this debate seems to be going backwards from our perspective, from our personal opinions, that we sort of have a debate where we think about what can technology currently provide from an encryption standpoint, and then sort of from the options that currently exist from a technology standpoint, debate or decide, or whatever you want to call it as a society, what we want in terms of what ability or lack thereof we want for law enforcement to be able to access the content of encrypted messages. And our starting point is that this is backwards. This is not the way the technology usually works. First, we usually figure out what social problem we want to solve, and then we figure out how to build the technology that can actually solve it. That's really the right way to go. And from our perspective, the starting point of our work is to sort of posit two claims that I think are true, which is that, number one, that there's some very small fraction of messages out there in the world, either files on somebody's phone or messages sent in transit between two people using some sort of communications device. There's some very small content of those messages that actually serve some public value to be known, some sort of public safety or law enforcement purpose. But that's a very small fraction. And then the second point is that the vast majority of messages and files and whatnot on people's machines are really none of the government's business, and that it is actively harmful to society if the privacy of that information is violated. So we sort of started from that starting point, and then from there we laid out a few requirements that are spelled out in some detail in the paper that are basically like, can we build an encryption scheme that can simultaneously meet a few goals? And at a high level, the requirements that we posit say something to the effect of, number one, we wanted to make sure that whatever encryption scheme we built, even if it allows a nation state, a law enforcement agency to read the contents of a few encrypted messages, that it would somehow, at least technologically, not just legally, but also technologically, prevent mass-scale bulk surveillance. Number two, the second requirement that we had was that basically that it would sort of minimize increase in system complexity. As we all know, the more lines of code I make you add to a computer program, the more ways that it can break and fall apart. And so we wanted to make the changes that had to be made to any kind of existing encryption software as small and simple and localized as possible, so as to minimize the increase in the threat surface from introducing any kind of change. And number three, we wanted to make it so that whatever encryption scheme we built is still compatible with all of the good best practices that we have with the deployment of encryption today, such as being able to protect keys in the places that you want, like HSMs, or such as using key evolution and forward secrecy, sort of rolling keys forward as you see fit, so as to make sure that the content of prior messages is protected over time.
I like that. And so, and we're going to, in the second half, we're going to talk more about the policy side of it. So you set out with those three requirements. And the concept you introduce is this idea of using a proof of work puzzle. Now, is this a new concept? in terms of how we think about key? I mean, is this? Let me back up. When we talk about encryption, there's always there's the algorithm that we use, and then there's the key, and then there's the key management. So when we look at the technical side of it, where does a proof of work puzzle fit in a very simplified view of encryption?
Right. So good question. So yeah, so with encryption, sort of the way we usually think about it, there is a message and there is a key, or maybe more than one key. They may be evolving over time. You may have to do some sort of key management as you described. But sort of at its very essence, there's sort of, an encryption takes a message and a key and it turns it into ciphertext, and then decryption takes the ciphertext and the key back into the message. And what we propose is basically to leave all of any kind of encryption scheme you want, AES encounter mode or whatever encryption scheme you want, as is, and to append to the side of that a small little puzzle, a cryptographic puzzle that is moderately difficult to solve, which by moderately difficult, I mean relatively large computational complexity to solve, that it requires a lot of effort, maybe thousands or even millions of dollars worth of effort to solve, but not so much effort as to be completely infeasible, which is what normal encryption that we use in the world today is trying to be, that it is basically there's no point in trying to break encryption as it exists today, because it requires thousands or millions or billions of years in order to crack the contents of, say, an AES encrypted message. And the point of this cryptographic puzzle that we attach to the side is that if you can solve this thing that requires some moderate amount of effort, then you will learn some piece of information. And that piece of information could be the message itself, or it could be the key that protects the message, which is effectively also giving you the message itself, or it could be even another puzzle that we could even compose these over and over again to provide some more nuance to security. But we can get into that in a second. But basically, the idea is, we take the existing good, very, very strong encryption that we have today, and we can attach to it some sort of puzzle that under limited circumstances might allow somebody who sees this puzzle to be able to open it, but at a reasonable cost to themselves.
Yeah, and what I like about that, correct me if I'm misunderstanding this. So as soon as you talk about reasonable or moderate effort, automatically thinking about clusters and multi-core machines and dedicated things that are able to process and essentially solve the puzzle. But what's interesting about that too is that gives us a time element. So like we might be able to size some of these puzzles using current computing technology and current understanding. It might take a couple hours or a couple days, and that almost is an interesting limiter when we start to frame this entire debate. Did I mischaracterize anything there?
No, that's right. And so, yeah, I think a lot of if you sort of go back through the history of the crypto wars, the current discussion tends to be dominated around this concept called key escrow, which was sort of popularized, I would say, in the 1990s, which sort of centers around this idea of, changing the way that, businesses would do key management by forcing businesses to send a copy of their key over to law enforcement agencies.
Yeah, and I think
if
today
we go back,
people struggle with why that's bad. That was my question: is why, if you believe, why is it key escrow good or bad? I guess, and give you an opportunity to describe it for our audience.
So I think there are a lot of there are a few different dimensions on which I think key escrow is not very good. One is just from sort of there are all sorts of social and legal questions that are some of which are frankly beyond my scope, about questions of if you do this for one country, what happens in different countries, questions of who within the government agency that you give this information to, what protections do you do to limit to prevent or limit the ability for abuse, that sort of you've given the law enforcement agency in principle the ability to read any message via key escrow, but then the question is to how do you make sure that they're not abusing this power? But also technologically, even beyond those actually quite important social questions, also technologically, the very concept of key escrow breaks the ideas that have been very innovative over the last half decade or so in terms of the advance of protecting people's communication. Things like forward secrecy, the idea of using ephemeral keys rather than long-term keys and rolling them forward and deleting old message keys, so that the contents of prior messages, you don't have this treasure trove that you have to protect for all the rest of time, meaning the stuff in your all the keys that you store, that at least you can delete keys as fast as you use them to encrypt messages, so that the contents of prior messages are safe, even if some bad thing happens to your machines in the future. But the very notion of sending a duplicate copy of all of these keys over to some government or other kind of entity kind of defeats the point of a lot of these novel innovations in protecting information. So, for both social and technological reasons, I think the key escrow approach is sort of suboptimal. And so what we did is sort of kind of went a little bit back in time to the crypto discussions of the 1970s, which tended to be more concerned with questions of key length, sort of how long do we make our keys for encryption for software. For instance, the data encryption standard going back to the 1970s, and also a lot of laws that pertain to export-grade cryptography, which basically mandated some maximum size to a key, something like 40 bits or 56 bits for keys. And the idea at the time was, could we find a single key length that a very, very strong computer that a nation state could afford could actually crack, but that anybody else, ordinary people and businesses, those machines would not be able to crack. And to us, at least at a very foundational level, that seemed a little bit more appealing to us than key escrow, if only for the fact that it makes the government do work themselves, right? It's not like we all have to hand all of our keys to the government and they then just have that information to decrypt data whenever they want. It seemed in some, I don't know how to formalize this, but some sense more fair to at least say, okay, hey, government, you have to do some work yourself. You have to have some skin in the game. And as a result, you have to limit the use of, what you're looking for, because you can't, even if you have a supercomputer, you can't use it to break every single message sent over the internet all at the same time. So in a sense, that was appealing. But in a sense, the reason that this key limit stuff going back to the 1970s didn't work is because of advances in Moore's law, that computers become stronger over time, and that everybody else sort of can, what you have that's just government only now, a decade later, is what everybody else has. And so what we realized is that, the issue is that there is no single strength of a cryptographic puzzle that we could make that only nation states could solve today and nobody else could solve in a reasonable time frame. That there was no, either we would make the system so weak that everybody could break it today, which is not good, or so strong that even governments wouldn't be able to break something today, which, depending on your notion of goodness, this may be good or bad, but at least it doesn't address the question that we were starting with, which is how do you allow governments specifically, to read some but not all messages. And so what we realized, though, to fix this was the thing that I mentioned earlier, that you don't just have to have one puzzle with one key length that sort of is the one thing to break for all of time, but instead you could sort of layer these together, that you could have puzzles whose solution simply gives you other puzzles and so on and so forth. So you could have a puzzle for every single message, but then on top of that, you could have a puzzle for every single, say, person who is communicating on say, an encrypted messaging system or something like this. And on top of that, you could have a puzzle for every single encrypted messaging system. They could have their own. And on top of that, you could have a puzzle for every single epoch in time, so as to deal with things like Moore's law. And that, law enforcement would have to solve every single one of those puzzles in order to even see the lower and lower ones, and they could each have different costs associated with them. So our sort of fundamental tool at a very high level for trying to figure out how to make it so that governments can read the contents of information, but not everybody else in the world, is to use economics, to use the fact that we can tune these original puzzles, these gatekeeper puzzles of, everything else under it is hidden from this, like the sort of the initial gatekeeper puzzle. We can make it cost, tens or hundreds of millions or even small billions of dollars, whatever scale or scope is necessary to make it so that only governments have both the resources and the financial incentive to be able to break those. And therefore, all of those other puzzles that could reveal the contents of your information are obscured from everybody else in the world who doesn't have the ability to solve that sort of initial gatekeeper puzzle. But that if you could solve the gatekeeper puzzle, even still, then you would see all of these per person and per message puzzles, but they would each cost some money, maybe tens of thousands of dollars or whatever society deems as a good setup in order to make it so that governments can, again, access some people's messages and some encrypted file contents, but not many and not the majority.
Well, and that's the trick, right? And I think that this is where there's a large misconception and misunderstanding about encryption. There are some people that are like, well, to understand encryption, I got to understand all the math behind it. But really it's in practice. And I think just to share a quick story, right? Like when we talk about Wi-Fi security, there's still today, even with WPA2 pre-shared key, which has been around for a long time, people don't understand. And you don't have to understand the math behind how it encrypts, right? But you get into conversations like, well, if more than one person has the pre-shared key, does that mean you can see someone else's data? And it's like, well, yes, if I'm able to capture the handshake. And so how does that factor into your risk equation and help you understand the benefits and limitations of the encryption based on the implementation? I think is what a lot of people struggle with today.
Right. So first of all, I completely agree that it's not that encryption is not as simple as simply saying this is all just math, because everything is about, well, first of all, how the math interfaces with the rest of any kind of algorithm or protocol that you've developed, and also how that thing actually is used by society. And both of these influence in either positive or, in many cases today, in the negative direction, the actual security of the system that you get. And so what we are proposing is to sort of build a system that tries to leverage whatever the distinctions we feel already exist between governments and other entities like businesses or individuals. So things like, if you wanted to, you could say have these puzzles or puzzles of puzzles, these composed puzzles. You could have them simply fly ephemerally on the wire right next to any kind of encrypted message, which simply means that only somebody who's even monitoring the network in the first place can even see the contents of these puzzles, which tend to be just very large organizations such as governments who have sort of access to the backbone infrastructure of the internet in order to acquire that kind of information. Another thing you can do is for, say, the information stored on a smartphone or a laptop, you could have the puzzles that we propose be physically on the device in some sort of protected space, like a hardware protected enclave or something where only somebody who has physical possession of the device can even see the puzzles. So again, it then means that it's reinforcing other kinds of, rather than sort of having technology only negatively harm societal factors, that you have everything from the rest of society that can bolster the technology, which is to say that only people who have physical access to your machine would even see these kinds of puzzles that would even give them the ability to even attempt to uncover what your messages say. And now you can use all sorts of other social norms and laws and ethics that we have developed around things like, well, theft in the person-to-person case, that you can't steal my laptop and I have recourses if you do. Or also when you're talking about people versus law enforcement, there are all sorts of norms and regulations and laws, such as the Fourth and Fifth Amendment, for instance, in the United States, that govern what and when and how governments can acquire the content of whatever is physically on your phone or laptop.
I love that. All right, so we're coming up on a stop, but let me just see if I can capture that last little piece, because we talked about, it's that Goldilocks problem, right? Is it too hard? Is it too easy? Is it just right? And what I like about this is then the puzzles are tunable, and the implementation scheme then is also tunable. So I know when I asked you questions like, well, what happens if the master puzzle gets compromised? Well, depending on how you set it up, you can rekey it all. You can issue a new set of puzzles. What happens if Moore's law holds true, or even if it derives off but computing power picks up? Well, we can change out some of the puzzles. So what I'm intrigued by and encouraged by is we leave encryption as encryption, and we leave then access to and management of using same principles but kind of separate, which gives us a way to tune it as we go. Did I capture that fairly elementary?
Yes, that's exactly right. And it's just like how today, we design encryption schemes different from how we design key management schemes. Exactly that kind of separation still exists. I agree.
Yep, that's awesome. All right, so we're going to take a quick break, and we're going to come back with Professor Varia, and now we're going to talk about the policy implications, how to have better discussions. This is a good chance. Remember, go to securityweekly.com, upper right-hand corner, survey 2018. 5 minutes of your time for better programming for the year and years to come. And while you're there, check out the other shows or on-demand content, things you might not know we're doing, but you're going to love them when you see them. And we'll be back in a minute. We'll talk about the implications. See you in a minute.